The morning sun filtered gently through the curtains, casting soft light across the kitchen table where I stood, carefully frosting a small cake. 30 candles, 3 decades marked silently on a modest chocolate surface. It was Daniel's 30th birthday, a milestone I'd hoped would finally bring us closer, but the house felt heavy with the quiet of unspoken things. The clock ticked steadily, measuring time that seemed to stretch endlessly. I arranged a few balloons I'd bought the day before, their pastel colors clashing with the muted walls of my suburban home. I set out the cake on a delicate plate, the frosting still soft beneath my fingers. The air smelled faintly of vanilla and lingering coffee, but there was no sign of celebration beyond this solitary preparation. It was strange, really, how one could fill a room with decorations and still feel utterly alone. Daniel hadn't called. Not in the morning, not in the afternoon. And I knew deep down he wouldn't. Years of strained conversations and distant silences had taught me to expect his absence more than his presence. Yet, despite it all, I had hoped today would be different, that the weight between us might lift, even if just for a few moments. I'd rehearsed what I might say, how I might bridge the gap that had grown too wide to cross. I sat down at the table, the cake untouched before me, and I let my hands rest in my lap. Outside, the suburban neighborhood hummed with life. Children's laughter from a nearby park, the distant bark of a dog, but inside, the walls seemed to press closer, the silence heavier. I thought about Daniel as a boy, the way his eyes would light up when he ran through the fields behind our old house, the sound of his laughter echoing through the rooms. Those memories felt like fragments of another life, a past I could reach for but never quite grasp again. The phone sat on the counter, silent and cold. No messages, no missed calls. I checked it again, almost hoping for a mistake, a forgotten dial tone, or a ringing that would shatter the quiet. But nothing. I couldn't help but feel a stab of disappointment twisting in my chest, a familiar ache that had settled there over the years. I thought about the birthday cards I'd sent in the past, the ones tucked away in a drawer unopened, the gifts that had gone unacknowledged. Daniel had grown distant, retreating into a world I couldn't follow, his life moving at a pace I couldn't keep up with. His silences spoke louder than words ever could. The afternoon waned, the light shifting slowly as shadows stretched across the floor. I took the cake from the table and placed it gently in the refrigerator, preserving the moment like a fragile hope. I poured myself a cup of tea and sat by the window, watching the world outside move on without notice of his quiet day. I wondered if Daniel thought of me at all, if my absence was a space he felt or simply a void unnoticed. I remember the times I tried to reach out, calls that went unanswered, messages left hanging in the ether. Each attempt chipped away at my hope, but I couldn't stop myself from trying. It was that lingering hope, stubborn and fragile, that kept me holding on, waiting for a sign that he still cared. As evening descended, the house grew colder, the silence deeper. I lit a single candle on the cake, its small flame flickering in the dim light. I whispered happy birthday, my voice barely more than a breath, a wish sent into the emptiness. No footsteps approached, no laughter filled the room. It was just me, the candle's glow, and the weight of years spent hoping for something that never came. I found myself tracing the edges of old photographs, moments frozen in time, Daniel's first steps, his graduation day, family holidays that now felt like distant echoes. Each picture told a story of love and loss, of a connection frayed by distance and silence. I clung to those memories like a lifeline, even as they reminded me of what had been lost. The night deepened, and with it, a quiet sorrow settled over me. Not the sharp sting of anger or bitterness, but a soft, aching sadness that wrapped around my heart. I knew that this birthday, like so many before it, would pass without fanfare or acknowledgement. Daniel had chosen to remain distant, and I was left to hold the space between us. Yet beneath the sorrow, a faint ember of something else flickered, resolve, perhaps, or the faintest glimmer of a new understanding. I didn't know what tomorrow would bring, but tonight I sat with the truth of my solitude, the weight of unspoken words, and the fragile hope that maybe, someday, things might be different. For now, though, the quiet was all I had, and I let it settle around me like a shroud, marking the passing of a day that should have been filled with joy, but was instead filled with the silence of absence. The morning after Daniel's silent birthday, I found myself sifting through a stack of papers he'd left behind months ago, old bank statements, tax forms, and a folder marked with his name in neat, precise handwriting. I hadn't intended to look, really. It was just one of those restless moments when the house felt too empty and curiosity whispered louder than caution. As I flipped through the pages, my eyes caught on a document, an inheritance statement from a trust fund I hadn't known the details of before. $10 million. The number stared back at me, stark and immovable, a fortune Daniel had never mentioned and, as far as I could tell, never touched. The sum seemed surreal, almost cruel in its quiet abundance, considering the silence that had swallowed our relationship. My fingers trembled slightly as I held the paper. This was a wealth beyond anything I'd imagined, and yet it was buried beneath layers of neglect and distance. I sat back in my chair, letting the weight of the discovery settle over me. I thought of the sacrifices I'd made raising Daniel alone, the countless nights working extra hours, the quiet prayers whispered in hope rather than certainty. All those years spent trying to build a life for him, and yet here he was, indifferent to the very legacy left in his name. There was a strange mix of disbelief and hurt swirling inside me. How could someone have this much, and yet act as if none of it mattered? How had our bond frayed so completely that money, something I'd never prioritized, had become this silent monument to our disconnect? I reflected on the life lessons I'd hoped to pass on: kindness, responsibility, the value of giving. It felt as if those lessons had dissolved into the void between us. The house was quiet again, the ticking of the clock louder now, marking moments that felt increasingly fragile. I thought about what this inheritance represented, not just wealth, but the potential for meaning, for purpose. Yet Daniel's neglect made me question everything I'd believed about legacy. Was it merely a transfer of assets, or something deeper? Something that had been lost along the way? That night, the house dark except for the soft glow of a bedside lamp, I wrestled with my thoughts. The anger simmered beneath the surface, tempered by years of patience and love, but the resolve began to take shape. If Daniel wouldn't claim this inheritance, wouldn't acknowledge it or the woman who'd fought to give him a future, then maybe I could find another way to give it life. I imagined the money working quietly, invisibly, in places where it could matter, supporting children who dreamed like Daniel once had, funding education programs in neighborhoods struggling for hope, helping build communities where kindness wasn't just a word but a living reality. These weren't just acts of charity, they were statements, a way to transform neglect into something meaningful. The idea grew steadily, a quiet rebellion born from years of silence. I knew I would have to move carefully, discreetly. Daniel's name was on the papers, but his absence gave me space to act without immediate confrontation. I could honor the sacrifices I'd made, the lessons I tried to teach, by turning this inheritance into something beyond the cold numbers on a page. I thought about the long conversations I'd had with friends, the small charities I'd supported quietly over the years. They were trustworthy, dedicated, and in need of resources that Daniel's fortune could provide. It felt like a way to reclaim not just the money, but a part of myself that had been overshadowed by years of disappointment. As dawn crept through the window, I made my decision. I would donate the inheritance, little by little, to causes that reflected the values I held dear. It wouldn't be about punishment or spite. It would be about hope, about planting seeds where something beautiful could grow. Daniel's neglect had left a wound, but it wouldn't define me or the legacy I chose to build. I imagined the faces of children I'd never meet, the communities that would find new life because of these gifts. It felt like a quiet victory, a way to rewrite a story that had seemed so fractured. And though it was a secret I would keep closely guarded, it was also a promise to myself, to those forgotten places, and perhaps someday to Daniel. The night stretched on, but in the stillness, I found a spark of strength. The inheritance was more than just money. It was an opportunity to reclaim dignity, to turn absence into presence. I folded the papers carefully and placed them back in the drawer, a small smile touching my lips for the first time in a long while. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new questions, but for now, I slept with a heart lighter than it had been in years, carrying the quiet hope that even in neglect, there could be grace. The first call felt like stepping into a shadowed room, unsure of what I might find but compelled to move forward. I reached out to the small educational charity I'd supported quietly for years, the one that worked with youth in underserved neighborhoods. Speaking to the director, I explained that I wanted to make a substantial donation in Daniel's name, though I didn't want him to know. The hesitation in my voice was real, tangled with a mix of guilt and determination. As the weeks passed, I arranged transfers to several organizations, schools, community centers, programs focused on empowering young women, and initiatives aimed at providing scholarships for children who lacked the opportunities Daniel had been given. Each donation was deliberate, tied to a value I wished Daniel had embraced: education, community, hope. I was careful, choosing trusted contacts and ensuring the funds would be used with integrity. The quiet secrecy of it all weighed on me. I wrestled with the knowledge that Daniel was unaware that these gifts might feel like betrayals if he ever found out. Yet, I told myself it was a lesson of a different kind, a way to show him that wealth without heart was empty, that true legacy was measured in lives changed, not numbers in a bank account. Late nights became my confessional hours, when I sat alone with the paperwork, double-checking the transfers, making notes of the impact reports I requested. I imagined the faces behind the letters, the teenagers clutching textbooks, the mothers attending workshops, the children stepping into classrooms they'd never dreamed possible. It was a world away from the cold silence that had defined my relationship with Daniel. Sometimes, the weight of what I was doing pressed down hard, and I felt a pang of loneliness sharper than before. Was I punishing him, teaching him a lesson, or simply reclaiming a part of myself that had been overshadowed by years of neglect? The answers weren't clear, but the act itself became a quiet rebellion, a way to turn absence into presence, to rewrite a story that had seemed so fractured. I kept the secret tightly guarded. Even close friends didn't know the full extent of what I was doing. It felt safer that way, a private defiance against the coldness I'd endured. I feared confrontation, the sharp edges of anger Daniel might throw if he discovered the truth. But more than fear, I felt a fierce protection over this new purpose, a fragile hope that maybe, just maybe, these gifts could plant seeds where there had been only emptiness. The donations began to ripple outward. I received letters from the organizations, stories of children who had graduated, programs that expanded, communities that thrived because of the support. Each one was a balm to my heart, a reminder that from neglect could come renewal. I kept these letters close, reading them in the quiet moments when the silence felt too heavy. There were moments when I questioned myself, when guilt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. Was I overstepping? Was this my way of holding on to control in a relationship that had slipped beyond reach? But then I remembered the years of waiting, the unanswered calls, the absence that had become so familiar. This was my way of speaking, of making my voice heard where Daniel had chosen silence. The act of giving in Daniel's name felt like a reclamation, not just of money, but of meaning. I wasn't just a mother left behind. I was a woman choosing to write a different chapter. The charity dinners I attended, the meetings I sat through, the thank you notes I received, all of it wove together into a tapestry of quiet strength and purpose. One evening, as I reviewed the latest impact report from a scholarship program, a familiar ache surfaced. I thought about Daniel again, the man he'd become, the son I'd lost and hoped to find anew. I wondered if he would ever understand why I'd done this, or if he would see only betrayal. But that night, beneath the weight of uncertainty, I felt something else, a fierce hope that love could take many forms, and sometimes it had to be spoken in silence. I continued to move forward, balancing the scales between love and disappointment, secrecy and hope. Each donation was a step away from the pain of neglect and a step toward a future I chose to believe in. Daniel's name remained on the papers, but the legacy was no longer his alone. It was ours to share, whether he knew it or not. And in the quiet moments between the transfers and the letters, I found a strange peace, not in reconciliation, not yet, but in the act of choosing. Choosing to give, to hope, to reclaim a part of myself that had been lost in the shadows of absence. The phone rang late one afternoon, its sharp trill slicing through the quiet of the house. When I answered, the voice on the other end was unmistakable: Daniel. There was a tightness in his tone, a mixture of shock and anger that caught me off guard. He'd heard about the donations through someone connected to the charities, and the news had clearly unsettled him. "You did what?" he asked, disbelief threading each word. "You gave away my inheritance without telling me? How could you do that?" I swallowed hard, feeling the weight of years pressing down in that single moment. I could hear the frustration in his voice, the sense of betrayal that had taken root. But beneath it all, I sensed something deeper, a crack in the armor he built around himself, a flicker of confusion and maybe even pain. "I did it because you never claimed it," I said quietly, choosing my words with care. "Because the money was just numbers to you, but to me, it was a chance to make something meaningful. I wanted to do something good with it, something that mattered." There was a long pause, the kind that stretches thin and fragile over the phone line. When Daniel spoke again, his voice was quieter, less certain. "You should have told me. We could have talked about it." I nodded, even though he couldn't see me. "I know, but after so many years of silence, I didn't think you'd listen. I wanted to act, to create a legacy based on values, not just wealth." The conversation that followed was tense, a collision of unspoken grievances and unmet expectations. Daniel accused me of betrayal, of overstepping boundaries, and I listened, understanding the anger but refusing to let it define our exchange. I spoke of hope, of compassion, of a future that could be built from the pieces left behind. Though the confrontation deepened the rift between us, it also forced us both to face the fractures in our relationship. For the first time in years, words were exchanged, clumsy, painful but real. I realized that beneath the anger was a shared longing, a mutual desire for connection that neither of us had found the courage to claim. Meanwhile, the impact of the donations began to ripple through the community. I attended a local event where a new after-school program, funded in part by the donations, was celebrated. The room was filled with children's laughter, parents' smiles, and teachers' gratitude. I watched as lives were touched in ways I'd only imagined, and a quiet pride swelled within me. The community's appreciation was a balm to my bruised heart, a reminder that even in fractured family ties, there was a larger circle of care and connection. I wasn't just Daniel's mother anymore. I was a woman whose choices were making a tangible difference beyond the walls of our strained home. Yet, the shadow of the argument with Daniel lingered. I knew the path to healing would be slow and uncertain, filled with tentative steps and fragile trust. But beneath the turmoil, I held on to a quiet hope that this confrontation was a beginning, not an end. In the weeks that followed, I found myself reflecting deeply on the nature of family, legacy, and forgiveness. The money had been a catalyst, but the true work was about understanding and acceptance of ourselves and each other. I began to see that the wounds between us were not just about inheritance or silence, but about the deeper yearning to be seen and valued. At night, I read the thank you letters from the organizations once more, feeling the contrast between the warmth of their words and the coldness of my son's silence. It was a paradox that unsettled me, but also strengthened my resolve. I realized that the legacy I was building was not just financial, it was emotional and spiritual, rooted in compassion and resilience. I embraced the complexity of our fractured relationship, knowing that love could exist even amidst pain and misunderstanding. As I sat by the window one evening, the city lights twinkling in the distance, I allowed myself to feel both the ache of loss and the promise of growth. The journey ahead was uncertain, but for the first time in a long time, I felt ready to face it, not alone, but with a faint hope of reconciliation. The donations continued, quietly weaving threads of change through the community, while the conversations with Daniel opened new, tentative doorways. It wasn't a neat resolution, but it was real, a step toward healing that neither of us could have predicted. And in that fragile space between anger and understanding, I found a glimpse of peace, a reminder that even broken stories could be rewritten with courage and grace. The days that followed our fraught conversation were marked by silence, but it wasn't the same heavy stillness that had defined our past. There was something new beneath the quiet, a tentative space opening between Daniel and me, fragile but real. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, he began reaching out. It started with a text, brief and cautious, asking about the impact reports I'd shared. Then came phone calls, awkward at first, filled with pauses and half-formed thoughts, but they grew longer, more genuine. We met one afternoon at a small cafe halfway between our homes. Daniel looked different, less guarded, his eyes searching rather than avoiding. We spoke about the donations, the programs they had supported, the children who had benefited. He listened, really listened, and I felt a shift in the air, a quiet thaw in the frost that had settled between us for years. It wasn't a sudden reconciliation. There were still wounds to tend, resentments to unravel, and misunderstandings to confront. But in those moments, I saw glimpses of a son I'd lost and the man he was becoming. I realized that forgiveness wasn't a single act, but a process, one that required patience and openness. As our conversations deepened, I found myself reflecting on my own journey. The choice to donate Daniel's inheritance had been born from hurt and disappointment, but it had evolved into something far greater. It had given me a new identity, not just as a mother grappling with estrangement, but as a woman creating a legacy rooted in compassion and action. I began to see that legacy not as a static inheritance, but as a living, breathing force, one shaped by choices, values, and the courage to act even when the outcome was uncertain. The money no longer represented what Daniel had ignored. It symbolized the change I could foster in the world around me. In the quiet moments, I often caught my reflection in the mirror and asked myself if I was living with truth. The question was both simple and profound, urging me to embrace my voice, my purpose, and my worth beyond the role of a forgotten mother. I learned to find strength in vulnerability and to acknowledge the pain without letting it define me. The Light on the Lake Foundation, the nonprofit I had founded using the donations, became a beacon not only for the community but for my own healing. Speaking at events, sharing stories of resilience, and connecting with others who had faced loss and estrangement, I discovered a sense of belonging and purpose that had long eluded me. I stopped dwelling on the absence of Daniel's presence at family gatherings. Instead, I focused on those who chose to be there, the friends, neighbors, and strangers who had become a chosen family. Their support reminded me that family wasn't always defined by blood but by love, respect, and shared commitment. One afternoon, I read a local newspaper article about a failed development project proposed by someone I recognized, Trina, Daniel's wife. The community had rallied against her plans, preserving the lake and surrounding land that had been in our family for generations. The news stirred a quiet satisfaction within me, a confirmation that my choices mattered, that the values I stood for resonated beyond our personal struggles. The lake itself became a sanctuary, a place where I could reflect on the journey I had traveled. The water's steady presence, the gentle lapping of waves against the shore, offered a metaphor for resilience, the ability to endure, to change course, and to find peace amidst uncertainty. Teaching workshops through the foundation, mentoring women who had faced invisibility and loss, I found joy in connection and growth. Sharing wisdom gleaned from my own experiences, I helped others reclaim their voices and their spaces, weaving a tapestry of strength and hope. Through this journey, I came to understand that reclaiming my story was not about rewriting the past, but choosing how to live in the present and shape the future. It was about embracing my identity fully, with all its complexities and contradictions, and finding peace in unexpected places. I hope that my experience resonates with others who feel overlooked or forgotten. It's never too late to reclaim one's space, to choose oneself, and to step into the light with courage and grace. The legacy we leave is not just one of wealth or inheritance, but one of love, truth, and the quiet power of resilience.